Okay, I think now we are live. Yeah, yeah. Um, so how you doing? Thanks so much for your time with us, for your talk. I'm here with my edition of Marx the Day Arcade. Um, it's in Portuguese. Was published by the Autonomia Literária. And Jamie is here with us to talk about the book and whatever more the gamification, whatever he wants anymore about the subject.
Thank you very much. Obrigado, Eduardo. Unfortunately, that is the limit of my Portuguese, so I'm going to have to speak in English. But the first thing to say is it's a real pleasure to be able to come and speak to you all in Brazil. I have a lot of fondness for Brazil, and it's always very nice to engage with Brazilian academics and Brazilian students. And I've been very lucky to have some of my research translated into Portuguese and published in Brazil, as Eduardo says. And so what I'm going to do for this talk, I'll talk for about 30 minutes, maybe slightly less, so we have some time for Q&A. And I want to talk to you about video games and Marxism, and if I have some time, also to talk to you a bit about gamification.
Perfect.
So where to start? Sorry, Eduardo.
No, perfect.
Great. Hopefully the audio and the video quality is okay.
Yeah, it's for me it's fine here. I'm just seeing if people are addressing now. Um, yeah, it's okay. It's fine. For me,
Okay,
it's perfect.
brilliant. So I guess the place to start with something like this is to, always a difficult question to ask after you've published a book, but why write a book about Marxism and video games? And I guess the first thing to say is, I grew up playing video games. Video games are now a part of mass culture under capitalism, but also I'm a Marxist, and I think that Marxists should have something to say about everything. I mean, lots of Marxists feel like they have something to say about everything, but that Marxist analysis shouldn't just be limited to talking about historical events or particular points of theory, but should have something to say also about popular culture. And in that sense, I follow on from Stuart Hall. The book starts with a Stuart Hall quote, where Stuart Hall argues that popular culture is one of the sites where a struggle for and against a culture of the powerful is engaged. It's also the stake to be won or lost in that struggle. Stuart Hall argues that it is an arena of consent and resistance, partly where hegemony arises, but also where it's secured. And so he argues that it's not a sphere where socialism or some kind of socialist culture already fully formed might be simply expressed, but it's one of the places where socialism might be constituted. And he finishes by saying that this is why popular culture matters. Otherwise, he says, to tell you the truth, I couldn't give a damn about it. And for me, this was part of the project of writing about video games and Marxism, to think about the struggles over the production of games and the struggles over the play of games. And so what I wanted to do, I guess one of the side missions of writing about Marxism and video games was to try and play video games while I was at work. And to be honest, if you want to play video games while you're at work, don't write a book about video games, because this will take up much of your time. But one of the games that I did play, and I think this is a useful example for thinking a bit about Marxism and video games, is Assassin's Creed, and in particular Assassin's Creed Syndicate, which is set in London in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. And actually, where I'm sat now in London is just up the road from one of the major parts of London that's featured in the game, which is Whitechapel in the east of London. Of course, this neighborhood has changed quite a lot since the time featured in the game. But one of the things I thought was very interesting is in this game, and if people are familiar with the series, it has a storyline that moves through various historical periods with a kind of somewhat convoluted plot involving aliens and Templar knights and assassins, a kind of long historical sweep. But in this one, it's set in London in 1868, and it features Marx. So, of course, this is a good starting point if you want to think about Marxism and video games. And so I played through this game and thought I'd met Marx. Unfortunately, it was Darwin, the beard, of course, being a little bit similar. But eventually you do meet Marx. And what Marx asks you to do is to engage in a mission for him. You meet him outside a factory. And the mission says, help Marx to find proof that the factory is abusing its workforce. Now, of course, this being a game with a focus on action, you have to jump in through a window. You have the option to assassinate some guards, to set fire to some things. And you come out with a report on factory working conditions to give to Marx. Now, of course, you might not be surprised to hear that the game takes some historical license with the actual details of what Marx did. But of course, when Marx was in London, he was very, very interested in the conditions in factories. And what we do know is that Marx spent a long time at the British Library. He spent a long time reading factory reports, different documents produced for government inquiries, trying to understand what was happening inside factories. Of course, there's much less evidence of whether he employed assassins to do the same thing. But what it does is it gives a glimpse of a very particular kind of Marxism. Often when we think of Marxism, we think of large-scale studies of capitalism. You know, we think of the work that Marx did for Capital in its various volumes. We think of, you know, the activities of communist parties over many decades. But this bit that we see of Marx in Assassin's Creed is a different side of Marx that he comes to later in his life, where he becomes very interested in inquiring into the details of factory workers' lives, of trying to connect the theorization of capital to the lived experience and the struggles of factory workers themselves. And this is the inspiration that I've taken for thinking about Marx and video games. It's an approach that Marx himself calls workers' inquiry, of trying to combine research with organizing, with the production of knowledge about work as part of a political process. For Marx, this involved a very lengthy survey that he sent out to French workers. But really what he wanted to do was to make contact with workers in different industries and talk to them about their conditions. And this was really what I wanted to do with Marx at the Arcade, was to first think about the overall structure of the video games industry, to think about how video game production has changed, to think about the kinds of people involved in the production of video games, and then also to think about the role of video game play. And so what I'm going to do with the rest of the talk is talk a little bit first about the production of games, and then finish by talking a bit about the culture of play. One of the strange things about the video games industry is it's constantly talked of as a very new industry, as a new industry that's only relatively recent, that hasn't been around for so long. You know, there are lots of changes happening in the video games industry. And in one sense, this is true. You know, there are many industries under capitalism that have existed for quite a long time, that are very well established. And really, we only see the birth of the video games industry in the late 1950s. We see the first video games being produced by American scientists employed by the military, experimenting with this new technology, these new computers, in which they were meant to be planning American military strategy or missile trajectories, that instead people found different ways to use this technology to play games with each other instead. And in one of these nice examples, when I was researching for this book, my dad is a software developer, and so is my stepmom, who's Brazilian. She's from Recife in the north of Brazil. They're both computer scientists. And I talked to them about this and said, did you ever come across examples of, when people should have been using computer hardware for some kind of military or industrial or government purpose, and instead people played video games? And my dad said, yes, when I was a student, we had to do a project planning industrial calendars. So to make sure that industrial machinery was used regularly, that capital was, getting its worth out of machinery. And instead, they found a way to play a golf game on the computer hardware. So they, in their spare time, wrote this bit of software and then would play it when they should have been doing work. And this is a kind of the hacker impulse, in a way, of using things for the different purpose, of using things for enjoyment or fun instead of for work, which is really at the kind of birthplace of the video games industry, but also in many ways continues to today. And so there is a kind of dynamic that we see in the video games industry, where people find new ways to use technology, develop games, hack games, play games themselves, and then either capital or the military see the potential in these games and find ways to commodify them. Find ways to sell them back to people to kind of grow an industry around this. Now, of course, we've come a very, very long way from hacked games on military hardware to the kind of video game industry that we see around us today. Huge scale corporations, the very large video game companies, Microsoft, Sony, Activision, Blizzard, EA, and so on. And really what we see today is a video games industry that has grown faster and become much larger than any other form of visual culture or entertainment. So to give you one example of this, the most profitable media commodity of all time is Grand Theft Auto 5. This is the commodity that has made more than any film, any piece of music, and in a way summarizes the shifts that have happened in global production over the last 4, perhaps 5 decades. Technically, Grand Theft Auto is made in Edinburgh in Scotland. It is a product of Rockstar North. The headquarters of this company are in a very particular place. But of course, that game wasn't just made in Edinburgh in Scotland. It was made in studios across the world with complex teams interacting with each other, relying on hardware from China, from other parts of East and Southeast Asia, that requires a global supply chain and commodity chain in order for us to be able to do whatever we want to do in Grand Theft Auto. And I think really the pandemic has only intensified this. In Britain, the video games industry is one of the few sectors that continued to grow during the pandemic. In fact, grew much faster during the pandemic. And so in a way, this has become a mainstream part of capitalist culture. And so it should be no surprise that many more people are working in this industry. And one of the main reasons why I chose to write this book was a series of events that happened 5 years ago now, where there was a wave of union organizing in the video games industry. There have been a number of issues, long-term labor issues in the video games industry, particularly focused around overwork. So it's not uncommon for people in the video games industry to work very, very long hours and often work periods of what's called crunch, these overwork periods, before the release date for a big game, so to make sure it's finished on time, and these sorts of things. This is a very classical labor issue in many ways. Working more hours than you're paid for is something that Marx would have recognized very clearly when he was looking at factories. In fact, Marx talks about two strategies that capital has to intensify exploitation. The first being absolute surplus value extraction, so increasing the amount of time that people are at work, and says that this is a classic tool of factory exploitation. And then also relative surplus extraction, which is making people work harder whilst they're at work, often through the application of technology and these sorts of things. And chapter 10 of Capital, Marx talks about the length of the working day in detail. And so what we see in a modern capitalist industry is a very old form of labor exploitation taking place. And to give you a sense of the scale of this, I don't know what the maximum working week is in Brazil, but in the UK, the maximum working week is, well, the standard working week is 37.5 hours. This is 9 to 5 with a lunch break every day. If you work more than the standard working week, you can only do this temporarily, and you can only go up to 45 or so hours a week. I've spoken to video game workers in the UK who would work as many as 90 or 100 hours a week in the run up to the release of a game. And so this means that one individual worker, if you're working 100 hours, is doing the work of 3 people. Might not surprise you to hear they're not being paid for the work of 3 people. And so this is a very kind of classic form of labor exploitation. It also has another effect on the industry, which is if you work very, very long hours, it's only possible for people who can work very long hours to take that work on. So if you have caring responsibilities, you have to look after a family, it's very difficult to work 100 hours a week. You can't pick your children up from school or nursery. You can't do the cooking and cleaning and other activities needed in a household. And so what we see is a gendering of the industry, that very long periods of overwork mean that you get predominantly younger men who work in the industry because they are less likely to have those responsibilities. And then because you have predominantly younger men who don't have those responsibilities, you can do more of these periods of overwork. And so there is a kind of self-reinforcing relationship between crunch and the development of sexism in the industry. And so overwhelmingly, you have a workforce that is made up of younger men who have a relatively short tenure in the industry. And that makes it very hard for people with caring responsibilities, people from marginalized genders, people with different life experiences to be part of the industry. And so there are many examples of scandals that have happened in the industry, but I want to give one example of this from somebody I met in Britain who said that they once lost a job, and they lost a job because they had the word feminism in their Twitter bio. And when they were given a job at a company, part of somebody from the audience of the game went through the new hires' social media to find out who the company were hiring, and opposed the hiring of somebody who thought feminism was a good thing or something to have in social media, and then pressured the company to get rid of this person. And the company, rather than standing up for the rights of the person they'd employed, didn't want to cause a scandal or a kind of issue with their audience, and so instead let this person go. And so what you can see is there are very clear issues that people would want to organize around in the industry. It's a very, very profitable industry. There's a lot of potential to pay people in different ways, to think about more equitable ways of organizing the industry, and huge profits being made by a very small number of people in the industry. And so one of the ways I think about this in the book is thinking about the class composition of video game workers in the industry. And here it's about thinking of class composition as a material relationship that people form both in relation to their workplace, but also in relation to the communities they live in, the communities they exist in. And you can see some very clear aspects of technical composition, how people are composed in the workplace in the video games industry. There is a huge desire for people to work in the industry. As one of my colleagues jokes, people who make video games like video games, and that comes with all of the cultural features and passions of people who want to be part of an industry. There are these big issues of overwork, but there's also some important factors of social composition, how people are composed outside of the workplace, particularly in relationship to gender, to sexuality, to race. The forms of oppression intersect with the video games industry. And these factors shape the ways in which people in the industry struggle, so the forms of political composition that we might find. And so in 2018, there was a moment, an international wave of unionization started in the video games industry, following a conference in the US in which some video game workers tried to get together to discuss unionization and whether or not it was appropriate. And management at a number of different companies did possibly the best thing for encouraging unionization, which was to tell workers in the video games industry that they shouldn't do it and it was a bad idea. This, of course, if your managers tell you not to do something and it's a terrible idea, often this means it's probably quite a good idea, right? And so across the UK, across North America, parts of Europe, Southeast Asia, there have been a number of different attempts now to build trade unions in the video games industry. I was very lucky enough to meet the first video game worker in the UK who wanted to form a trade union, and supported them as part of my own trade union, trade union organizing. And I've witnessed their growth from one person to the formation of a trade union branch, to running campaigns, to organizing around the industry. And I think this is a really important moment for thinking about two things. The first is, what does trade union organizing look like today? In Britain, we've had a number of waves of new union organizing. Much like in Brazil, we've had strikes of food delivery workers, app-based workers of various kinds who have joined unions for the first time. And I think video game workers are an interesting example of a sector that people consider to be, an industry that people fight to be a part of. It's kind of office work. It's not traditionally seen as the kind of work that you would organize in a union. And it's also a place where unions haven't shown much interest in organizing. And so the ability to organize trade union of video game workers also shows other workers that it's possible to organize in a union. There are reasons you might want to do this, and give a kind of positive practical example of this. The second reason why I think this is important and interesting is thinking about what impact an organized workforce could have on the video games industry. So as I said at the beginning, I like to play video games. This isn't a criticism of video games more widely, but a lot of the culture that we see in the video games industry is based around military video games, games with themes that are often quite positive about imperialism. If we think about the Call of Duty series, for example, these are games that celebrate the military in one way or another, and are often tied directly to the military through licensing arrangements or or military consultancies of one form or another. But also we see, the shaping of the video games industry in ways that are not beneficial to players. So maybe some of you in the audience have had this experience, but sometimes I try and play a video game, some popular AAA title, and I start playing the game and I feel like I'm having a good time, and then it tries to sell me something, or then there is a new challenge that has been designed to keep me being part of the game, to try and get a certain number of something, or to get a certain number of points, and it's something to keep you playing and to keep you engaged in the game. That often a lot of the shorter, more creative experiences that we have in the games industry are not profitable in quite the same way. So the whole industry and the forms of culture it creates become shaped by the demands to make a profit, which causes problems for people who are engaged in the play of video games. And it's not very often that we get companies asking the people that make video games, what kind of video games would you like to make? But I think what we could be certain of is people who are passionate about video games, people who want to be part of the industry and make things that they're excited and proud of, don't want to engage in the monetization of every single aspect of the game, or introducing aspects of gambling to make sure people carry on playing. And so the idea of greater workers' power in the industry isn't only about having fairer conditions under which games are made. We would want the people who are making our games to be treated fairly, and to have time for family and these sorts of things, but also to think about the kinds of politics of the games that are being produced. And I think we're living through at the moment a renaissance of political video games. One of my favorite examples recently, which perhaps people have played, is Disco Elysium, a deeply political game in lots of ways that introduces a number of different themes about politics, about revolutionary defeat, kind of exciting and interesting range of things. But we're unlikely to see a sequel to this game because there's been a struggle over who owns the IP, over how it's going to be monetized and so on. And so I think it's important for us, if you see yourself as a critical theorist or a Marxist or somebody on the left, to care about these issues of working conditions and about culture. And if you don't have an interest in this, we should think that there are others in society who have taken a big interest in this. And I think particularly in those video games communities in which toxic cultures have been allowed to proliferate, around games where there's often, quite sexist communities, or communities that, have allowed, these kind of hostile attitudes towards the workforce to originate, that figures on the right, on the alt-right, like Steve Bannon, have seen these as places to test out alt-right politics and act as recruitment grounds for politics that then bleeds into street movements and big political events like we've seen in the US. So what I want to finish on then is an argument for why Marxists should be interested in games, but also why people who are interested in games might want to think what Marxism can offer. And the first is, for Marxists, I think the video games industry provides, the global commodity, almost par excellence of our time, that shows us how production is changing on a global level. The different forms of material and immaterial labor and how they combine to produce commodities, the changing role of production in the global south and global north. It provides an incredibly powerful example of what new forms of worker resistance can look like. The wave of organizing in the video games industry has been incredibly exciting and shows us new forms of trade union organizing that could be applicable elsewhere. It's also a form of culture that we should be engaged with. Many Marxist figures have talked about the importance of culture in one way or another, the importance of print media. Lenin talks about the importance of cinema. Others talk about photography or other forms of mass production of culture, and the video games industry is no different. But also, as I said, that it's not only the left who are interested in video games. That for a very, very long time this has been a political arena, but it's been a political arena in which only the right has been organizing, and often organizing quite successfully. For those who are interested in games, what can Marxism offer? Well, I hope what I've been able to show in this talk so far is that we can be critical of video games, but we can have a positive critique by thinking not only about the content, not just talking about the problem of violence in video games or whatever it might be, but instead talk about the problems in the way in which games are created, the role of labor in video games, to think about how production shapes the kind of games that we get, for better or for worse. That if you're interested in a better online culture, one that is more inclusive, that has spaces for people to explore games in the ways that they want to, that workers' power in the video games industry offers a way to cut across these problems that can look incredibly hard to deal with or to solve. What do you do about these online communities? To think about how workers' power could be a lever to change the ways companies relate to, build, and maintain these communities in one way or another. And I think, in particular, it's by paying attention to what's happening in the workplace that we can begin to unpick these sorts of relationships. And so I want to finish with the final comment that we get in Assassin's Creed after you accept the mission, the final mission from Digital Carl, which is to follow Marx. Thank you very much.
Uh, uh, so we can open to questions now, right? Um, there's a question here. Uh, just Mateo Jimenez asking if there's a way to buy the book directly from you. I think not, but you can answer. This one you can buy directly from the publisher if you want the translated version. The
Yeah,
autonomous.
if you want the translated version, it's directly from the publisher. I think they sell it through their website.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I don't sell the translated version. I can send you a copy in English directly, but yeah, the translated one from Autonomia Literaria.
Yeah, and after this, we can pass your contacts if he likes. Um, there's a question from Dimitri. Dimitri is a doctor in social psychology, work psychology, and he's asking you if you are in touch with nowadays mobilizations and unionize after the COVID in the video game sector. Still,
Yeah, so I'm a member of the same trade union that the video game workers in Britain are a member of. It's an independent trade union that organizes across a range of different sectors. And so I've spent quite a long time with video game workers in Britain. And they've been organizing for 5 years now. So they organized before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic. And what I would say is one of the major changes in the video games industry, which maybe some people who work for universities here can relate to, that for many years they were told they couldn't work remotely. They had to go into the studio, they had to be there in person. During the pandemic, everybody was working from home in the video games industry. And now after the pandemic, there is a struggle to maintain that remote work. So lots of people are now being told they have to go back in every day. And I think there is resistance from a lot of workers to do this. That it's better to choose where you want to work and so on. I do think this raises big challenges for union organizing. I love to work from home, but it's much harder to have a union meeting on Zoom, by phone. To have those in-person meetings, I think, is a key part of how we organize unions and these sorts of things. So I think there are different challenges in the waves of unionization. I also think the point that we're now getting to is that in different countries, say in Canada, in the US, in France, in South Korea, in Britain, unions have taken different models and different approaches to organizing in the video games industry. And I think we're starting to see different successes and strengths and weaknesses come out of that organizing. So there's still a lot of experimentation happening, which is really exciting to see happen in real time, right?
Do you have any news from the global south? You said a lot of England and Europe, but do you know any union here in for the global south, for us Latin America and South America?
Yeah, it's a very good question. What I would say is the the video games industry is differentiated between the global north and the global south. That many of the big companies are headquartered in the global north, um, the US, parts of Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, and so on. That there has been much more success in establishing unions in those countries, so things are much further ahead. And that a lot of the video game work that happens in the global south is subcontracted video game work. So smaller companies that are taking on parts of the work. This is particularly the case in India, in China, in parts of South America. And I know there have been some early attempts to establish unions in Argentina, and some discussions in Brazil. There are existing IT unions in the south of India that have been doing this organizing. But things are a little bit more complicated in China because of the role of the state trade union there. So I'd say it's quite different, the ways in which this happens has happened in the global north and the global south. But we're still very early in this wave of unionization. So hopefully there's more to happen.
Yeah, hopefully. There's one more question. Richard wants to know your opinion on Valve work environment. I don't know if you know.
Yeah, that's a great question. Valve is a very closed company. It's very difficult to know the specifics of what the work environment is like. And one of the problems, if you ever do research with the video games industry, is lots of video game workers sign NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. And so there's often a lot of hesitancy to talk about working conditions. So to give you one example of this, the first video game workers I met wouldn't tell me which company they worked for. Some of them wouldn't tell me their names because they were so worried about speaking up about their working conditions. So I don't know the specifics of what it's like to work at Valve, but what I would say is if you don't know what it's like to work at a company, it's probably not good. This is a kind of a fair guess, right?
Yeah, yeah, I agree. He said here in the comments that they have a flat hierarchy. They don't even have fixed salaries since those are determined by the workers in a self-merit system and things like that. Do you think this is a good thing, a bad thing? That's
Yeah, look, whenever I hear examples like this, I think of an example at Netflix. At Netflix, you can take as much holiday as you want. There is no limit on the amount of holiday you can take. This sounds like the best policy ever. But the reality is, if you can take as much as you want, nobody wants to be the person taking the most holiday. And so on average, everyone takes less holiday. And so without knowing the specifics of how things happen at Valve, you know, just because the policy sounds good doesn't necessarily mean it works in practice. And what I would say is if companies want to bring in policies that are really going to improve working conditions, they should allow workers the space to unionize, and they should recognize trade unions, and negotiate with trade unions, because that is a way to ensure that those power relationships are kept in check, right?
Yeah, yeah. Another question here is, what do you feel about monetization of games? If it could help the developers or it wouldn't? That what is the current scenario?
I mean, I think monetization in games is really interesting because many of the many of the monetization models that we see in culture more widely have been experimented with very early on in the video games industry. So the kind of software as a service model, we see this happening very early on in the video games industry. Steam as a sales platform, where you're no longer buying the physical game, but you have the right to download it, but it can be taken away and so on. Like these early models of monetization have been experimented with in the video games industry. And I have no problem paying for video games, to make sure that the devs receive some kind of payment for it. But I think there are lots of different monetization models that are not necessarily positive for uh, for the production of culture in a sustainable way. I think particularly, there's been a lot of controversy over the DLC, over downloadable content models, where you're no longer buying a complete game, but you buy the game and then you keep having to pay over and over again afterwards. And I think part of this is how competitive the video games industry has become. There are so many games being produced that companies are trying to find new ways to monetize those games, not because they want the games necessarily to be good, but because they want to make a profit, right?
Yeah, yeah. Now, a question for me, by me, right? There's not from the chat. In most of the arcade, you see a little bit of Mark Fisher realism capitalism, right? Uh, how would you, for people who don't know yet, Mark Fisher, would you recommend? How do you create the link between this Mark of the Arcade and Mark Fisher realism capitalism? I think it's a good question for people starting to look into leftists.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is I would really recommend that people read Mark Fisher's work. I think he's a very important theorist who has a lot to say about capitalism today, but also about culture. And I think I'm right in saying that capitalist realism has been translated into Portuguese.
Yeah,
I'd really recommend people read it. I think it's an excellent text. The connection that I would make for this is I would say that Mark was rare on the left in the period he was writing, in that he takes culture seriously. He wasn't writing about culture from the sidelines, criticizing capitalist culture, but trying to take seriously what the role that culture can play in struggles for and against capitalism. And so in particular, his writing on music is fantastic. He's draws these I think very important points out of his analysis of music. um, and I think this is the kind of often I would have conversations with people who would say, if you're a Marxist, you should be talking about something important. Don't talk about culture. I think Mark's work is an important reminder that this can be part of a liberatory project to take serious culture in this way.
yeah. So, any last questions from the chat? Let's see. Think. Um, let's wait if anyone else has anything to say. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. We of SABER and computer science students from Brazil, w- we got very glad with the news of your talk. I think people enjoyed a lot. I think in this chat.
Great.
Uh,
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, it's always a real pleasure to come and speak to a Brazilian audience. So yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Um, and I think that's it. Thank you for your time, and bye. Thank you so much for your attention.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, everyone.